again in session?
Good afternoon. I know you're beat. And I mean, and we all appreciate your attention. It's been a very long day for you and for everybody. And I'm, like Mr. Akakis, I'm sorry for that, but I just hope that you'll just bear with us and let us say our piece, and then you can decide this case, all right? This case, as I told you from the beginning, is not about a homeless, helpless, harmless, mentally ill guy. This is about Kelly Thomas, who was homeless because he beat his 73-year-old grandfather with a fire poker. He couldn't stay there. He was homeless because he put his hand around his mother's neck and she had to call the police and get a restraining order, so he couldn't live there. This is a case that involved Kelly Thomas with outbursts of anger and violence over years. And it was violence you couldn't predict. You couldn't foresee. You couldn't see that this was what was going to happen, and you couldn't prevent it. This included his mom, his granddad, security officers, a little girl at a fruit stand. These were spontaneous acts of violence that nobody caused except Kelly Thomas. And whether he was doing this because he took drugs when he was a kid, whether he was doing it because he was mean, he still presented a danger. And we're not smearing Kelly Thomas. He smeared himself with his conduct. And this shows you that what these officers were dealing with on July 5th was a dangerous guy, a very dangerous guy. This case isn't about a bully cop who was trying to just beat down a homeless guy. It's about a police officer who for 10 years protected his community and did everything he could do to keep the community safe, including the homeless people. And he used training, and he relied on the training, and he followed the training that he received at the Fullerton Police Department. He followed exactly and did what he was told. He acted the way they told him. This is how you react. This is how you do it. He followed that to a T. And now he's being charged with murder for following exactly how he was trained. He didn't kill Kelly Thomas. He didn't cause Kelly Thomas's death. He did not use excessive force. He's not guilty of murder, and he's not guilty of manslaughter. He did exactly as his trainers told him to do. I'm going to talk about the law, then I'm going to talk about the facts, then I'm going to try to put those together. But I want you to remember through all of this the thing that the prosecutor wanted to get away from, and that is, he says, Fullerton Police Department, they don't make the rules. They don't get to set up their own standards. Well, you know why. You know why the people say that. Because they know that everything that he did, and he did, was how they were trained, how they were told. And every other police officer in Fullerton was taught the same thing. And so that's how they got to move away from that. They got to say the whole department is unreasonable. They got to say that everybody there's crazy because they can't live with the testimony that they got on that issue. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the law. They make us wear these things, and if you're not used to wearing them, then it sort of does what it's doing. All right, so murder. That has elements, and the defendant commits or omits an act that causes death. Now, this is important because cause has a special meaning in the law. It's not the usual cause that you think, and I'm going to talk about that. He commits it with malice. He kills without a lawful excuse or justification. Now, Mr. Caucus didn't talk about that at all. but they have the burden of proving that that didn't happen. So that's murder. Involuntary manslaughter is, and there are three theories that the prosecution has on involuntary manslaughter. One of them is a crime, that there was a 149 excess use of force. The other is a lawful act in an unlawful manner. And the third legal theory for involuntary manslaughter is had a legal duty and failed to perform. That's a whole bunch of things that were said by Mr. Akaka. Says, well, he had a duty. He had a duty. Ramos had a duty because he detained Kelly Thomas. And so everything else flows from that. I'm going to talk about that. But those are the theories. On each one of those theories, the prosecution has to show that in all of those, that the act which caused the death was committed with criminal negligence, and the defendant's act caused this death, caused the consequence, all right? So you'll see that in both murder and manslaughter, they have some commonality. One, the prosecution has to prove that the acts or omissions caused death, and two, that the acts were committed without legal excuse or justification. So if we look at murder, malice is this. The defendant intentionally commits or omits to commit an act. This has to be something that's unlawful, too, by the way. Malice is he intentionally commits or omits an act. The natural consequence of the act is dangerous to human life, and he knew it was the natural consequence of the act was dangerous to human life, and he deliberately acted with conscious disregard of human life. That's malice. That's the malice that's up here, and that's an element for murder, not for manslaughter. Now, for manslaughter, you have criminal negligence, and that, you'll be instructed, is more than ordinary careless inattention or lack of judgment. It's something more than that, all right? The defendant has to act in a reckless way that creates a high risk of death or GBI, and a reasonable person would have known that acting in that way would create such a risk. The way he acts is so different from ordinarily careful person would act in the same situation, they amount to a disregard to human life. So that's criminal negligence. Again, we're talking about conduct which is unlawful, all right? Unlawful conduct. So what about, and this is causation, caused the death. This is sort of tricky, and you're going to have to look at all of the instructions to understand this, but the defendant acts or omits, and this causes the death. Okay, so this act has to cause the death, all right? Has to cause the death. Now, there's two parts of it. One is the act. Now, this act has to be a substantial factor. What that means is it's something more than trivial, not remote, and there can be more than one substantial cause. But they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there was a substantial factor, that what he did was a substantial factor. Now, if what he did is a substantial factor, it doesn't matter if there was Kelly Thomas was in a vulnerable position, or there was bad medical treatment, or some third-party activity. If Officer Ramos's act was substantial, not like he was standing away and verbally telling Kelly Thomas, you know, you have to do this lawful, you have to respond to this lawful command. But substantial. It's got to be substantial. So that's the first part of caused death. That's the act. The act has to be substantial, all right? If it's substantial, then it has to have been a direct natural and probable consequence, okay? So you have the act. The act has to be the direct, natural, and probable consequence. Has to cause the death, all right? And what that means is a reasonable person would know that that's likely to happen. So when he does this act, a reasonable person would know, you'd know it. When you do this act, when you say that word, you see these fists? They're going to fuck you up if you don't do what you're told. A reasonable person would know in their mind that what's likely to happen is what? What happened? Death. So that's what the prosecution has. That's what caused means. All right, so what else? Killed without lawful justification or excuse. So the prosecution has to prove that, and there's more of these, I just put these down. The prosecution has to prove that the act that he committed that caused the death was without lawful excuse or justification. They must prove the negative. They must prove it wasn't that. They have to prove it wasn't an accident, and I'm going to show you what that is. They have to prove it wasn't an accident in the heat of passion. They have to prove it wasn't a justifiable killing by a peace officer. Now, we don't get to this until they've shown that it was a substantial factor and that he caused the death. And they haven't done that. But we don't get to this part unless they did show this. So what is excusable homicide? Well, the instruction says the defendant is not guilty of murder or manslaughter if he killed someone as a result of accident or misfortune. If he was doing a lawful act in a lawful way, you know, like trying to detain and arrest someone, if he was using or acting with usual and ordinary caution, as Rubio said he was, and he was acting without any unlawful intent, there's been none shown, then he's not guilty. He's just not guilty. And the prosecution has to prove that wasn't so. A person acts with usual and ordinary caution if he acts in a way that a reasonably careful person would act under the same or similar circumstances. And how do you measure that? Well, you look for a reasonable person in his position, reasonable police officer, and how do you decide that? Well, what is the training? What are they told? When they go out in the street, what are they told? How do you act? How do I act in this circumstance? And they were told. Okay, so before you can determine whether any act committed by Officer Ramos was a substantial factor or a reasonable person would know was likely to cause death, the people have to prove what the cause of death was. And they have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. It seems like a pretty simple thing, but here there's some controversy over it. Dr. Singhania said it was chest compression, mechanical chest compression, which caused this death. But what did she say first? After she'd done the autopsy and after she's seen the video, what does she say about the cause of death? She tells the DA's investigator, who says, hey, what's the cause of death? She says, you guys got to do more investigation. Now, understand, their story has matured, has evolved from 2.5 years ago when they were first doing the autopsy. And they were looking for a cause of death, looking to do something. But when they first did this autopsy and they got this video, they showed it to Singhania and they showed it to Gugalan. And they said to Singhania, well, what's the cause of death? And she says, go do your, you guys do your investigation. That's what she said. When they get to the preliminary hearing, a hearing, some time back, she testifies under oath, same oath that she took here, and she says the cause of death was mechanical compression and it's a discrete event. I can tell in the video, she said, under oath, I can tell when that happened. And that happened after Kelly Thomas stopped screaming. It happened afterwards, and we took her through the video, and Manny Ramos is away from Kelly Thomas, and she says, now. That's what she said at the prelim. And I asked her, well, is it a discrete event? And she goes, it's a discrete event, a one-time event. The problem that she had, and the prosecution had, was that Manny Ramos was nowhere near the chest, nowhere near the Kelly Thomas, and so they couldn't put any cause of death on him. They couldn't do that. So then what happens? She comes to the trial and she says, well, now this is sort of a evolving thing, It's something that stops and starts. Well, and then I said, well, didn't you say it was a discrete event? She says, sort of hemmed and hawed, and then the judge says, well, do you know what a discrete event is? Maybe there's a miscommunication, right? But there wasn't. She says a discrete event means a single event. But now she was confused at the preliminary hearing, and so now it's something that happened over time, because her original sworn testimony shows he's not involved at all. So that theory, that has to evolve. So then Dr. Lekowa says, well, I think it's mechanical compression too. But how did he get involved? He got involved because when he saw that there was this investigation, he called the DA's office. And he says, I want to talk to you. And why? Well, because he was told by paramedics that there was a difficult intubation and that Kelly Thomas had coded for 18 minutes. Well, if that's true, he told Mr. Akakis, if that's true, then these cops didn't cause it. It's a medical, he says, mishap. But they just fouled up, and it would be more than a little mistake in medical treatment. It would be outcome determinative, and that's why Lekowa went to the DA's office and said, that's what I was told. I was told 18 minutes coded and a difficult intubation. That could explain this death. But then he looked at the St. Jude's records and determined they didn't have a difficult intubation, and so he's on board. Well, this is Exhibit 305. And you remember Dr. Vilk talked about this. It just so happens that there was a difficult intubation because the ETT, the tracheal tube, had to be put in twice, had to be adjusted. And Dr. Vilk says, you never put that down unless it was a problem. You never make a note of that unless it was a substantial problem. Well, that sort of sounds like what Dr. Lekowa said he heard from the paramedics, doesn't it? A difficult intubation. It just happens. And of course, the paramedic says, we never said that. And Dr. Lecqua says, I can't remember, it was the paramedics, but you know. But it just happens that there is this record of what could only be characterized as a difficult intubation. In other words, they put it in at 24, measured from the lip line, and then they have to pull it back. So there's a problem. Well, the transport of Kelly Thomas was at 21:13. They adjust the ET, the tube, at 21:30. Well, that equals 17 minutes and a difficult intubation. It's just precisely what Dr. Lecqua had said was the reason that he contacted the DA's office. It just happens that it matches almost, well, exactly to within 1 minute. And I'll tell you another thing, too, that is curious. There were people there. Primary RN Mary Lentini, Dr. Song, Rachel Navidad. There's a bunch of people there. Did any of them come in and say, oh no, this isn't a difficult ETT. We didn't have a problem with that. These notes don't mean that. They did not. And you have to ask yourself why. The burden of proof is on the prosecutor. And this is sort of an important thing. It was so important that it got Dr. Lecqua out of the OR down to the DA's office to say, I don't want these guys getting prosecuted on account of something that happened, a medical mishap. But then he reviewed the records, obviously not this one, and said, okay, they're clear. That's a problem. The people's burden is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and we don't get started on all this other stuff until we get cause of death. And there's no answer for that. All right, how about Dr. Hugalon? Well, he's Singhanya's boss. He said all those things that Mr. Akakis put up there, but he said a couple of other things too. He said that he disagreed with Singhania when she testified it was a discrete event, and he doesn't remember, he doesn't recall, Singhania answering the DA's investigator's question with, you guys go figure it out, when asked about the cause of death. He just doesn't remember that. Dr. Vilk testified, and you know who? He's not some dope. He's a medical professor. He teaches ER, medicine. He's done all the original research on this. He's in charge of the jails and the care of inmates in all of San Diego County. He's looked at this issue of mechanical compression and asphyxiation for years. He has debunked the biggest medical myth about positional asphyxia and asphyxia in custody that lived in this medical community. For years, everybody's going along thinking the guys who got hogtied and are bent over, they died of asphyxiation. So all these cops who put on these hobbles are getting charged with or sued, or the county's getting sued for this piece of medical information which was pure myth. So he's that guy. So when you're sort of measuring up and saying, is there a reasonable doubt as to the cause, as to what caused it, not this cause, not this where it's got to be predicted. Not only do they have to show that it caused the death, but that he could have predicted this. He could have predicted that this mechanical compression would cause death. He could have seen that. Any reasonable person could see it, except for what? Except the leading medical doctor in the world, who's done all the research, says that's a bunch of baloney. And he got shown a letter where this very problem was discussed. He'd done the positional asphyxia studies, and then this other doctor says, well, I'm kind of concerned about what happened in this, actually what happened in our case. And a guy who gets laid on and might die in custody. So Mr. Cocker shows him this piece of paper. Well, this letter says it doesn't account for what we got going on here, does it? You know, implying that what he's talking about are apples and oranges. Dr. Vilks says, you're right. But then I asked him on redirect, well, did you do some more studies that accommodated for this? And he goes, yeah, we did the studies. They're peer-reviewed. Nobody disputes him. Nobody in the medical community disputes Vilks' original studies on this issue, not just positional asphyxia, but on this laying on a person and compression stuff. So when you start thinking about, well, it's pretty simple how he died, not only is it pretty simple, but these guys should know it. And what does Vilk tell you? That's not what happened. Then you got the cardiologists, Karch and Budoff. Both of them are smart. One of them's a pathologist. One of them's treating. One of them says they've got a dispute over that. So what does all this medical testimony tell you? Where do you sort of end up after all of this? There's like a controversy. You know, there's like an active controversy among leading minds in the country in these fields. So they can't agree. They can't agree. And they're like really smart. Yet Mr. Cocker says, well, they can't agree, but these guys, they should have known what Singhania was going to say and should have predicted what the result was. All right, so let's look at what Mr. Caucus's theory is on this. What is it that Officer Ramos did or did not do which gets him into the big casino, which makes him guilty of murder? What is it? He made an unlawful threat. These fists, they're going to fuck you up if you don't start listening to me. That's the beginning of the people's case, and really that's the end, because he says that's illegal. He says that created in Kelly Thomas the lawful right to resist, and that everything after that, everything that he did was criminal. Not only that, but everything that every other officer did, even though that wasn't criminal, also becomes his crime based on that initial statement. Because he's saying it's illegal and that Kelly Thomas has the right to run. Because if he doesn't have a right to run, more importantly, if he doesn't believe he has a right to run, if a reasonable police officer wouldn't believe he has a right to run based on that statement, then he's off the chart. He's off this case. Because everything that follows after that, even their expert won't even talk about. He says, well, it begins with this unlawful threat. So, just think about it. We saw a lot of gore and stuff like that. It's horrible. We listened to the video. That's horrible too. But let's look at what the theory is to put him, to make him a murderer. Any police officer, any reasonable police officer would know that when he uttered those words in that circumstance, what does he have to know? What would a reasonable person know is likely to happen? Well, Kelly Thomas is going to flee. Kelly Thomas is going to fight. Kelly Thomas is going to fight so much that they have to do a code 3. He'll continue to resist. And after all that, Kelly Thomas, who he knows, he doesn't know his name, but he knows him, after all that Kelly Thomas is likely to end up dead or beaten down real bad, great bodily injury. So that's what they have to prove, and that's being proved. That's being proved on the basis of the threat. Because that is what the prosecution uses to make Kelly Thomas's flight lawful. Because if his flight is not lawful, they lose. And they knew that when their surgeon testified at the prelim. They knew that when she said this compression started after Ramos got off. So they got to have another theory. And they got this one. Of course, the statement of Officer Ramos was one he could make. He could use force. He could use force. He told Kelly Thomas he was detained. And he could use force to maintain the security of that situation. He could use force, and he could also use a lesser form of force, which is the threat of force. He could use that to get him compliance, and that's what he was trying to do. His words were not any different from saying, if you don't comply with my lawful order, then I'm going to use all force necessary in order to have you comply. That's certainly how that statement would be understood. And I'm going to talk about this alleged threat in just a minute. But before I get to that, I want to talk about the run-up. That is, how we get to the place where Officer Ramos and Kelly Thomas come together. And I want to look at who was Kelly Thomas. Who was Officer Ramos dealing with on July 5th, 2011? Who was he dealing with? Now, I know the prosecution doesn't like this. They say it's a smear. We're going to talk about it, but I don't think anybody could disagree that it's important to know what to judge them. It's important to know what they were dealing with. So what do we know? We know that Kelly Thomas starts methamphetamines in the 10th grade. Now, Dr. Cart says, look, his heart slides show this guy, he's changing the chromosomes. He's changing the cells. That's how much he used. The prosecutor says, well, there isn't any evidence that he used it except that he started in the 10th grade. And Dr. Cart's saying that the structure of his heart, the cells are different. So that means he's using it. So that's just a piece of information. And it's used for this. We know that he misconducted himself over a long period of time, that he was highly violent. Dr. Cart says, I don't know whether it's, and he used a word I don't understand, which just what he just means is, well, why would somebody do this? Well, it could be. We see it a lot in these meth overdoses. These meth users, doesn't have to be an overdose. It just, you use it, it causes psychosis. Or he could just be, and I forgot the word, but sort of mean, and that's why he spontaneously attacks people. All right, so what do we know? On July 8th, 1995, Kelly Thomas goes over to his granddad's house, who's 73 years old, and he hits him with a fire poker, not unlike this one. And that probably hurt, right? It would hurt, and it did hurt him. And he did it for no reason at all. The reason this is important is because he does things spontaneous. He doesn't have to have a reason. He reacts. When he doesn't get his way or the way he thinks he should get it, then he does bad stuff. He does stupid stuff. So what happens? He grabs this fire poker, and really, you saw that. The grandfather's now in his 90s. He beats him on the head, knocks him down. He tries to get up, he beats him again. And then what does Granddad do? Granddad goes to the bedroom. Why? Because there's a gun there. That's the kind of situation that Kelly Thomas is placing his own grandfather in fear of. He's going to get a gun and the phone. So what does Kelly Thomas do? And this turns out to be interesting as well. He leaves, and he leaves with not this. You'll see a picture of it. This one doesn't have a bow where Kelly's granddad had his head bashed. But you'll see a picture of it. But it's like this, and that's what the dad said, the granddad said. So what happens? What does Kelly do? He leaves, and he's walking out, walking down the street, you know, very casually. Not like some madman, not like some crazy person, not like some mentally ill person. He's walking away to get away from having beat his granddad for no reason. And the police are arriving, and they have only heard there's some sort of an assault. That's all they know. And they see Kelly Thomas, and he's walking down the street, and they're suspicious. They're suspicious. Now, they go over to talk to him and say, hey, what's going on? And he starts to walk away. And they say, hey, what's going on? Come back here. Well, they don't know who he's connected to. They don't have a description. They don't know what happened. But they have an instinct, okay? One that, you know, if you look at what Mr. Rakaka says, well, you've got to have probable cause for this. You have to do this. Otherwise, it's unlawful. Okay. So what'd they do? They're probably doing something unlawful. They see him walking away, and then they start to follow him, and then he starts running. He's running in and out and in and out and in and out. Oh, by the way, he's got this stuck down his pants. So what do they say? How do they stop him? They stop him at the point of a gun. They don't try to first tackle him. They don't say, you're being detained. They say, stop or I will kill you. Stop or I will shoot. Under Mr. Rakakis' theory, Kelly Thomas could think, well, gosh, I think they're going to kill me. Then he runs into the street, then somebody runs over him with a bus. Natural, probable consequence. That's how absurd this whole thing is. Those cops did the right thing. They threatened him. They gave him a conditional threat. They didn't say, I'm going to shoot you. They said, stop or I'll shoot. And that's what happened in this case. That's exactly what happened in this case. He's charged with murder. They get an attaboy at the police department. Why? Because they captured a guy with the deadly weapon who's on his way away from Grandpa's house. This isn't about whether or not a homeless person should be protected and given the same rights as somebody who is better off. This is about knowing what he dealt with. And what he dealt with was a very dangerous person.